Welcome to Asian Insider. I'm your host, Bhagyashree Garekar, and we're recording this episode on Monday, the 11th of May, 2026. This is an important week for the world. US President Donald Trump will be visiting Beijing very soon to meet President Xi Jinping, and to tell us whether their meeting will be a meaningful one is our guest today, Mr. Han Shen Lin, the China Managing Director for the Asia Group, which is a strategic US strategic advisory. Han is based in Shanghai. He also teaches finance at NYU, the New York University's Shanghai campus, and he's a US Marine Corps veteran. Welcome, Han.
It's a pleasure for having me on. Thank you.
Thank you. Where were you last posted as a Marine?
I was actually posted out in Okinawa as well as in the Philippines.
Okay, so you know Asia very well indeed.
Well, it was 30 years ago, so I was quite a younger man back then.
It doesn't look like that. When was your last trip to Singapore, if I may ask?
It was actually about half a year ago. I very much enjoyed traveling there with my family. And during my banking career, I spent a lot of time traveling, probably every couple of months or so.
Okay, so welcome to the Straits Times newsroom when you're next in Singapore.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I always feel smart talking to you, and I think our audience is going to have that experience as well. They'll feel they are smarter, well-informed after this conversation that we're going to have. So first, is the summit going to happen for sure? We know that China's confirmed it. Overnight for the US at least. And we are speaking a day after President Trump rejected Iran's proposal to end the war, which could resume. So do you see this meeting happening, or do you have any doubts?
I'm convinced it will happen. There's too much on the line to back out now. Trump wants to come, and Beijing is ready to be a good host, including with a state banquet prepared for U.S. CEOs. And certainly being here in Shanghai, the state media has halted negative coverage of Trump and the U.S. So basically, when Beijing confirms something publicly, that's not a trial balloon. That's a commitment. So unless we see actual missiles flying through the Strait of Hormuz in the next 48 hours, this summit will happen.
Okay. For the benefit of our audience, I must share with you that, it was the Straits Times you'll have read, which first published the news that the US was likely canceling the summit, which was originally expected to happen at the end of March. That was at the start of the Iran war. And that alert came to us, from a chat that I had with Han. And, as you can tell, he tracks US-China ties very closely. So, Han, how much of the discussion between Mr. Trump and Xi is going to focus on the Iran war?
It will certainly come up, but I don't think it'll be the centerpiece. What's important is that China buys roughly 90% of Iranian crude exports, so that's enormous leverage. Beijing could absolutely get Tehran's attention on a ceasefire, but will they? Not for free. Helping Trump out of a jam is a political cost for Beijing. They'll want something back, maybe tariff relief probably. So it's worth watching whether a trade concession and an Iran de-escalation get quietly packaged together.
So what are the chances that we can expect some kind of relief in oil prices, after this meeting?
It's hard to say because when you're looking at, for example, the low-hanging fruit and the expectations, certainly what's at the front of the U.S. agenda is, for example, the selling of airplanes, agriculture, energy, other topics such as fentanyl cooperation, maybe military-to-military cooperation. The Middle East is quite a complex issue. So I suspect with issues such as the Middle East, the U.S.-China trade architecture, and so forth, they will not necessarily be resolved so much as they'll be managed.
Okay. Now, there are also these sanctions that the U.S. has imposed on Chinese companies, Chinese individuals, practically on the eve of the summit. And China's putting up resistance to that as well. How do you expect the two sides to manage, frictions arising from that? How well will they manage it?
So when we think about it, one of the questions that often comes up is, how will President Xi and President Trump meet with each other? Will, for the example, have a hug? And certainly not. President Xi isn't a theatrical leader, but what we'll likely see is a very deliberate warmth, firm handshakes, for example, careful smiles. Trump will push and probe, as he always does, on key issues of interest, but Xi will likely absorb it, and he'll be patient that way. So I guess a good analogy of what we might expect is something very similar to when they met with each other in 2017 at Mar-a-Lago. It's almost a theatrical mutual respect between the two men who genuinely believe they're representing history. So I think we can expect something more on the optics side, but a lot of the deep fundamental differences between U.S. and China, such as export controls, such as security interests, Taiwan even. These are going to be complex issues that are going to take time to resolve. But the positive thing is this: the very fact that the two leaders are engaging at a very senior level gives political space for the working level officials to seek practical solutions.
Right. So no big fat hug, but we're going to get something valuable still out of this meeting. So answer this, Han. Why has Trump been so keen to go to China? We've heard him talk about it from practically day one, and perhaps even during his campaign time. And I guess related to that, what must happen for Mr. Trump to see that as, a very successful meeting?
So Trump needs a headline. He wants to go back to the U.S. with something he can call historic. Maybe big purchase commitments, a tariff rollback, maybe a splashy investment number. And we've seen this before with the original Phase 1 trade deal between U.S. and China in 2020. There was an enormous fanfare, modest world follow-through, though. Beijing has studied that playbook carefully, so they'll likely give Trump enough to tweet about, maybe a photo op, a handshake, a number, without conceding anything they can't live with structurally. But they do know this. Right now, there's also what are called the midterm elections. So it is the domestic politics that'll very much shape, for example, the position of the Republican Party in the U.S. side. So Trump is keeping that in mind as well. So it is important for him to at least achieve the optics of something and then perhaps follow through with some of the substantive deals over time.
So do you expect that, China hawks in the U.S. and the Senate and elsewhere, they'll have good things to say after the summit, that Trump has handled China well?
Well, from China's perspective, they have two choices. They can either deal with Trump or they can deal with a more hawkish Trump administration. So my suspicion is the very fact that Trump is engaging with China probably keeps some of the hawks a little bit uncomfortable. But there are certain things that are important. So, for example, as we think about the key issues that'll be looked at, semiconductor export controls, Beijing wants relief there. A pause on tariff escalation, certainly. And on Taiwan, China is basically not looking for any reversal, but they do want enough ambiguity in Trump's language to spin domestically. And one of the things that they'll keep very careful watch in the hawkish administration of the U.S. is really that the U.S. doesn't really shift its position on securities, certainly in relation to Taiwan and other issues as well. But Beijing would like to be able to kind of push the edges of that. So that's something we're going to have to watch very carefully going forward, because certainly as we look at the whole buffet of different types of issues, a lot of people and a lot of the various analysts around the world will be paying attention to how the Taiwan issue is explained and looked at.
So what is your personal guess as to what Trump might actually say on Taiwan?
My suspicion is, well, that's hard to say. What they're hoping for, certainly on the U.S. side, those who focus on security, is that he doesn't say anything kind of unexpected and random. But from China's standpoint, particularly since this visit of Trump coming to China, how President Xi performs is very much catered to the domestic audience as well of China. And so if he's able, or if China is able to kind of nudge a little bit of, pushing on the U.S. posture towards Taiwan, that in itself could be an optical victory. But we'll certainly see how it goes. It's, these things are kind of hard to predict at times.
True, agree with you. And I think Mr. Trump is indeed very unpredictable in every way. Um, on AI, is there going to be something vital discussed at this meeting?
I think something will come out, but I don't expect it to be transformative. So it'd be kind of like a Bletchley Park AI safety declaration in 2023, where it's dressed up bilaterally and both sides want to look responsible on AI without actually tying their own hands militarily or commercially. So I suspect you'll probably hear phrases such as dialogue mechanisms, risk reduction frameworks. It's not necessarily a breakthrough, but it's not a breakdown either. It's managed competition, I would argue, with better packaging.
Okay. Do you think there's going to be some kind of joint communique or joint statement at the end of the meeting?
Well, absolutely, if all goes well. In China, where I'm in right now, Xi is hosting an American president on Chinese soil, winning, hopefully, concessions on tariffs or Taiwan if possible. So the state media will make sure every Chinese viewer sees this, and I suspect Xi genuinely needs this right now. Because the property sector is still stressed, youth unemployment remains stubbornly high, a foreign policy win, especially against the US, is exactly the narrative he needs. It becomes proof that toughness works.
So a joint statement is possible, but not a joint press conference, for instance. Trump tends to have them sometimes with the foreign leader standing by his side. Is that a possibility at all?
I suspect we're going to have good optics of handshakes together. What they actually say with each other, it's hard to say, but oftentimes one of the interesting aspects is after these key leader-to-leader events, when you look at the U.S. government's readout and you look at the China side's readout, they're not always quite the same.
Absolutely. You're right. And we've spent at the Straits Times plenty of time trying to see those differences and how they stack up against each other. But returning to what you just said, that you expect this summit basically to improve, if I may put it that way, Mr. Xi's standing in China. But on the Trump side, he has this style of trolling foreign leaders, as we've seen him do that plenty of times, right? And very memorably with the Ukrainian president, right, at a press conference. But it's also very striking how respectful he's been whenever it's China or President Xi's come up, in how he addresses them, whether it's Truth Social or what he puts it, to U.S. reporters asking this question. Now, what do you think Beijing makes of this approach and how he addresses Mr. Xi or addresses China?
That's a good question. Whenever Trump brings up Xi, Beijing reads it very clearly. Trump respects power, full stop. He goes after Canada, the EU, South Korea, because he calculates they'll absorb it. China, on the other hand, pushes back economically, militarily, and Trump notices. So what looks like respect is really deterrence. Beijing doesn't trust it, and they're not naive about it, but they welcome it because it tells them they're in a completely different category from America's traditional allies, and that seems to suit Beijing just fine.
At this moment, leading up to the summit, which goes on over Thursday and Friday of this week, where do you score U.S.-China ties? Let's say on a score of 1 to 10. Now you're a prof, so, I have to ask you this question. So 10 being the highest, it has been ever since that breakthrough President Nixon's going to China. So what's the score now? What's the tally or grade, if you want to give it a grade?
That's a good question. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'd give it about a 6. We're in a fragile functional coexistence. But trade is flowing, channels are open. That is true, though, but the strategic distrust is still deep. So when we had the Bali and the San Francisco summits in 2022 and 2023, that at least put a floor under the relationship, which matters. But that said, the ceiling is low. Taiwan, technology, military posture. This summit might nudge it to a 6.5, but I probably wouldn't go higher than that. The two leaders sharing a banquet in Beijing doesn't necessarily rewrite the architecture of what really is a strategic rivalry.
Right. So the Bali and the San Francisco summits that you spoke of, those were under President Biden, of course, when Mr. Biden met Mr. Xi.
That's
Right.
correct.
Okay. So you spoke of strategic distrust. How has that changed from Trump's first term to now? Has it deepened, worsened, improved, likely to improve? What's your sort of take on that?
Well, on the China side, when you listen to Beijing and they talk about their strategy towards China or towards the US, they feel like they have seen something very similar in the first Trump administration. So this time through in the second administration, they have widened and deepened their toolkit for retaliation. So it's not only maybe conciliatory measures they can take in response to US actions, such as maybe buying more American goods, but they can also take many more escalatory actions. That could be something at a country level, such as choosing to depreciate the currency, or perhaps even targeting individual multinationals operating in China. So their toolkit, including, for example, their recent industrial supply chain security regulations, or perhaps pushing back on the US dollar sanctions regime, these all represent a China that has become much more savvy in thinking about how to increase leverage in their negotiations with the US. So they've brought a high level of sophistication that was really unprecedented compared to the first Trump administration. But the stakes are so high that they feel like they may have no choice to do so. Hence, when you think about China's posture overall, they continue to be very much security focused, perhaps at the top of the agenda among all the other issues they wrestle with.
Right. And how many times are they going to be meeting this year? There's been talk it might be 3-4 times. Do you go with that assessment?
That's a good question. Originally, at the beginning of the year, there was speculation there might be possibly 4 visits. For example, you have the Trump-Xi visit coming up this week, and then maybe a possibility that President Xi may visit the U.S. in the second quarter of this year. And then third, there would be the APEC meeting, the APEC leaders meeting in Shenzhen towards the fourth quarter. And then finally, the G20 in the U.S. Now, that's a lot of visits to get together with each other. So it's really hard to gauge how often it'll happen. But my guess is if I was to choose, they'll probably most certainly meet this week, most likely during APEC, the second quarter of this year. It's a harder case to justify, but the possibility of the G20 is still open and out there. So maybe up to 3 visits, but certainly not 4.
Right. And I think that's a nice note for us to wrap up on. You've given us a good read of what's going to happen, what's not going to happen, the big fat hug, for instance. And we look forward to, getting more of your analysis after the summit as well. Thank you very much for all your insights, Han. We hope you enjoyed the show and we'll share it around. And do sign up for our weekly Asian Insider newsletter. So this is Asian Insider. I'm Bhagyashree Garekar. This episode was produced and edited by Faiza Sani, our producer in Singapore. Thank you for joining us and see you in the next episode.